In this video, we're going to take a look at Diamine Aurora Borealis. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. There's tons of tone variation by pen and some really good shading. By name, Aurora Borealis is really ready to confuse you because now we have Aurora Borealis, Aurora Black, Noodler's Borealis Black, and it's easy to think that this is an ink that you've already tried. I really do see this as a very good ink for people to go with, and we should be willing to try out some different things. Now, while turquoise doesn't tend to be the color that I run to, it doesn't mean that I don't like them. I just don't see much need in having bottles of them because I don't use it very often. It's an only occasional thing for me, and that's much more of a preference. I do see this as a very interesting ink to look at that I really did enjoy using and found the color to be probably the most enjoyable turquoise that I've used. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Kaweco Sport with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. In the fine, we get no feather, no spread. We get some very nice shading all the way through it. I think the tone that's going on here is really nice to look at, much better than what we get with the medium. Where the medium is much darker a tone, and I feel like it loses a bit of its real character in this case. So I'm not caring for the medium, although it did have no feather, no spread, and there's occasional, just occasional, moments of shading. Now the stub was really cool because it gave some of that great tone that we got with the fine, all of that great shading, and the very nature of writing with a stub gave it the flair in the writing that often people using fountain pens like to see. So I really do like how that looked there in that stub. As we would expect, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Sailor 1911 large with a fine nib, a Jinhao X450 with a medium nib, a Lamy Safari with a 1.1 stub, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. In the fine nib, we get no feathering and no spread. We do get some shading, though not as much shading as we got on the Clairfontaine, being a little bit more absorbent paper. We still get a very pleasant tone here. Now, the medium is much darker than that fine and not as dark as we were seeing on the Clairefontaine. Now, with no feather, no spread, and no shading coming through at all, it's the darker tone here that isn't really wowing me in any kind of a way. I feel like there's something lost here with that wetter pen. The stub at the bottom is a little bit lighter than the medium, and while it's a little bit lighter, it still has some of the problems that the medium has. There's no feather and there's no spread, and there is a little bit of shading, but the shading is much harder to see here, and I think that's got more to do with the tone and this particular paper. But you do see shading come through, giving it just a little bit of character while you write. We can see here that we get a little bit of ghosting and no bleeding whatsoever. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. The fine nib has no feathering, no spread, and almost no shading. There's only a few spots that can be noticed. Not really anything stand out. The more absorbent paper is really eating up the quality or that particular feature of this ink. It's still a pleasant tone, but it's losing that shading that I think really is helping me enjoy this turquoise more than most. Now, the medium has tiny feathers in it in a couple of spots, but nothing stand out, and it's only noticeable when you really go looking for them. So, honestly, not a problem. We have no spread. We do have, I'm going to call it a couple moments of shading, like in the word dynasty at the end of Y, it gets a little bit darker, but I wouldn't really call it shading through this writing, only because there's only a couple of spots, two or three, where it's really coming through. Now, the stub gets to lighten up from the medium, looking much better on the page. It has no feathering, it has no spread. It does have a few spots of shading that come up, like you see it in the word that, the word university, the word also, the word but. It shows up a lot and very nicely. The stub really did well here. We do get a little bit of ghosting, the most minor of ghosting, and no bleeding. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. The fine on this paper has no feather and no spread and almost no shading. And while it's got no shading, I do find the tone to be very good and its own bit of flair to note-taking here. So the color looks really good even with the absence of shading. Medium is much darker than the extra fine with no feather, no spread, no shading, no standout quality, and I just don't care for this tone as much as I did from the fine. So for me, looking at this, I feel like it's losing a little bit of something. Now the stub is about the same tone as the fine with no feather and no spread. Only one or two spots, very, very light peppering of shading. I barely would call this shading for that reason. However, the tone is very nice on here, and the stub nib helps with your writing look very nice. We can see on the back of the page that we do get very minor ghosting, which is expected on this paper, but absolutely no bleeding. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Colorverse Morning Star. Here is KWZ Turquoise. Here is Private Reserve Blue Suede. Here is Schaefer Turquoise. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. The fine here has no feather and no spread. It has a couple of moments of shading that come up on its own if you see in the word thoroughly or in the word outlook or his or Alexandrians. You see a bunch of spots where it is darker, like the K in Greek. So we do definitely get to see some of that shading going on here. Very nice with no feather and no spread. The medium is much darker than the fine with no feather. I take that back because I'm looking at the word mathematics. And at the TICS, I see a tiny bit of feathering. But this is student grade paper, so I don't see that being such a big deal with this being a wet pen. No spread and no shading whatsoever. I don't care for this tone, and that's all I'm going to say for it. The stub is a little bit lighter than the medium. It's still a little darker than I would prefer seeing this. It doesn't wow me. Now we get light feathering that has occurred in a couple spots, like in the word he and in the word loved. We do get a little bit of shading that shows itself, which is nice. I just prefer the fine, which is actually perfect for a student. Looking at the back of the page, as we would expect, we do get a whole bunch of ghosting, but we get no bleed through whatsoever, making it great. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a black ink by J. Herbin, Pearl Noir. Here's a brown ink by Noodler's Kiowa Pecan. Here's a blue-black ink by Ackerman, their number 10 Iron Gall Blue-Black. Here is a yellow ink by J. Herbin, their Amber de Bermanie. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. The fine nib has feathering, tiny feathering all over it, really consistent, but not a deal breaker for people that have to use this paper. We get the tiniest bit of spread, but barely noticeable at all. It is just a little bit thicker than on the other pages. We have absolutely no shading that's going on, which we wouldn't expect. The medium, we do get spread like we would expect about to a broad. We get feathering, and it's a consistent tiny feather the entire way through, and we have no shading. All things that we really expect on this paper. On the stub, we have feathering, that is expected. We have some spread, again, expected. We actually get some spots of shading though, which is very remarkable to me because I really wasn't expecting it at all. Ultimately, I think the performance here so far has been pretty good. By opening it up, I see the back of the page where I circled a couple spots where it did dot the page underneath. Just to be aware that it will bleed through and touch like that sometimes. And on the medium where most of it showed up, that was a wet medium. Otherwise, we get a ton of ghosting, which again is expected, but not the end of the world with this paper. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? When it comes to the nib, looking at what it is that I was using, the dry fine I thought was awesome. I really liked the way it looked and really liked the shading that it was going to give me. It's probably the best look for this ink, followed by a medium flow stub. That stub did almost as well as the fine nib. Now, the wet medium really was too dark and made some of the nice qualities of this ink sort of get lost in it. And that is a problem you can always face when an ink is much darker of itself, its darker version. So I would avoid a very wet pen here. Thanks for watching.